Just think about this for a moment. Has there ever been a decade more influential in modern pop culture than the 80s? Take 1980 for example, the year in which this video will focus on. And we had some seminal moments in history, such as John Lennon being shot, the invention of the Rubik's Cube, the first incarnation of Pac-Man in Japan. Heck, we even found out who shot JR. Spoiler alert for this 40-year-old series. It was Kristen Shepherd. Sorry. And Iron Maiden released their self-titled album in the UK. All of these events still resonate today in some way, shape, or form, such as the impact the decade had on the world, and pop culture in particular.
Hello? Can I help?
And shows such as the phenomenally successful Stranger Things owe a lot to that era.
Why is no one else wearing costumes?
However, when you think about iconic images from classic 80s horror movies that are still relevant today, what springs to mind? Masked monsters tearing up teenagers on Halloween, or at lakeside retreats, badly burned dream-bothering psychos, or even the prominence of indelible horror heroines who outlast the killer. Images such as these has helped to shape our love and understanding of the horror genre. And being an adolescent teen with hormones raging like crazy, it was thrilling. One image that still haunts horror fans, and perhaps surpasses the aforementioned films however, is the river of blood that gushes from elevator doors, and also the creepy as hell twin girls from Stanley Kubrick's 1980 Stephen King adaptation, The Shining. And you think Vecna's penchant for snapping the bones of unwilling teens is creepy? Just wait until you witness his inspiration. Freddy Krueger using the veins of a young guy to walk him to death like a marionette. Or reducing Johnny Depp to a gushing river of blood. In this episode of 80s Horror Memories, we're taking a retrospective look at Kubrick's much lauded horror masterpiece, the many iconic images that define the film, the director's fractured relationship with Stephen King, plus many aspects of the production that horror fans may not be aware of, including how a certain famous kids studio shoehorned references from the film into its movies. So stop tapping out your sins on that typewriter and park that 80s trike as we take an alternative look at one of the most influential horror films of all time, The Shining. Before we dive headfirst, axe in hand, into The Shining, let's take a short segue down horror memory lane. You remember Blockbuster Video, right? Of course you do. Or if you're too young to have had the pleasure of spending hours arguing with your partner in the store about what to rent, you really have been missing out. They paved the way for home entertainment rentals back in the 1980s through to their most successful era in the early 2000s until they were eventually overtaken by a change in consumer habits. And, well, Netflix ultimately. In fact, there's still one open in Bend, Oregon, that Netflix have loosely based their new series on, ironically. Anyway, I digress. Blockbuster was awesome, but they didn't necessarily cater for this particular teenage movie fan desperate for a horror fix, and hoping to rent titles that were above their age. Fortunately, in my hometown, we had a smaller, independent rental store whose owner, let's call him Freddy to protect the not-so-innocent, had no qualms about renting R-rated movies to those who were not quite that mature yet. I'd skate down there on my Deathbox deck, rucksack on my back, high on nervous energy about which new movies Freddy had just got in that week. Classic titles such as Critters, Halloween, Fright Night, and House would happily be passed into my grubby, just teenage hands over the course of that year.
That is so unfair!
Until one day I happened upon a movie that would define and shape my love of horror movies forever. The Shining. Suffice to say, Freddy's rental store didn't last too long, but his help informing my love of all things horror is greatly appreciated. You rock, Freddy. Unfortunately, probably forwards and backwards in a prison cell nowadays.
You are concerned about him.
Yes.
And are you concerned about me?
The 80s horror films, or where I really started going to see horror films and watching horror films. I worked at a video store, like so many people, in 1983. So it was easy to have free access and go through the back catalog of horror movies.
Well, the memories I have of being a very young kid during the 80s is that horror movies were having a huge sort of upswing in both popularity and variety. And coupled with video stores, you could see so many more movies than you would be able to see at the theater. And I think a great deal of my love of 80s horror movies, and I think my knowledge of 80s horror movies, comes from home video.
In 1975, director Stanley Kubrick made the technically impressive, but much derided by critics at least, Barry Lyndon, a film about an Irish chap who attempts to make his way into the British aristocracy. The movie was visually and technically impressive, but bombed at the American box office, and was criticized for being overlong and slow. Reeling from the lack of appreciation for his movie, Kubrick decided that his next film needed to be something that would please a commercial audience, and at the same time be artistically fulfilling for him to make. Not an easy mix by any stretch of the imagination. But Kubrick set out immersing himself in the horror genre in order to make his ambitions viable. In fact, he became so immersed in the process that he would confine himself in his office and task his staff with bringing him stacks of horror books to get inspiration from. Disregarded books smashing off the walls would regularly be heard by his secretary.
The
Until these frustrated outbursts suddenly stopped. His secretary eventually went into Kubrick's office to check on her boss to find him fully immersed in Stephen King's novel, The Shining. The movie sees Jack Nicholson's Jack Torrance become the winter caretaker of the remote Overlook Hotel in Colorado, where he also hopes to cure his writer's block. He takes his wife Wendy and his son Danny, who, it transpires, is psychic and begins to have disturbing premonitions that worsen just as Jack's own writing suffers, along with his own mental well-being and stability, to say the least.
I said, I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm just gonna bash your brains in.
You know, The Shining is a landmark film in a lot of ways. For me, it was, Stephen King was my first sort of entry into horror films, but via reading Salem's Lot, and then reading The Shining after that. That was the second Stephen King book I read. And I had read the book before I saw the movie. And the movie is, it is so uniquely cinematic, and while it is very close to the book, it is also has a completely different feeling than the book, which is strange in and of itself to watch that, to have two very disparate experiences, both incredibly positive in terms of the entertainment value, and that was one of the first realizations that Jack in the book is very different than Jack in the movie. In the movie, he's so in your face crazy, but part of that it's a visual medium. In his descent. Whereas in the book, there's I think you retain compassion for him a lot longer. You feel his struggle a lot more, as opposed to his surrender in the movie. So that was, for me, one of the really interesting things. That was one of the first times there was two different, because often the book was either better or the movie's better, or that whereas in this instance, they were so close yet so disparate. It was a sort of schizophrenic experience, but it has so many landmark images in it and things that are horrific and that stay with you forever, and things that are hypnotic, right? It's a very hypnotic film, right from the first chords of the Wendy Carlos score as you're driving up to the lodge. It is dragging you into its world in ways that you don't realize.
What follows has gone down in history as one of the most talked about, theorized, and debated horror movies of all time. And despite it not being well received, critically or commercially at the time of its release, it has nonetheless endured as a classic horror movie in its own right. But what are the most indelible images from the movie? And all the fuss about how scary and disturbing the movie is, I hear you say. And what are these largely unknown facts about the production? Maybe plucky old Freddy had good reason to rent this movie to underage kids, as it can't be that disturbing, surely. Well, it was allegedly quite a disturbing time to be part of the cast and crew of Kubrick's film, as he insisted on having a small production crew, and his tendency to insist on multiple takes resulted in his overworked crew being exhausted. The cast also had their fair share of issues on set, and although he protected young Danny Lloyd by telling him the movie was a drama and didn't let him anywhere near any naked, decrepit grannies, thankfully, poor Shelley Duvall didn't fare quite as well. She does an incredible job of selling Wendy's increasing anxiety and despair after realizing she's trapped in a hotel where her husband wants to bash her brains in and also murder her worryingly psychic son. The stress of playing the character led to her suffering from nervous exhaustion, feeling physically ill, and also losing some of her hair. Just watch what that poor woman goes through in the movie and you can see why.
How could you? How could you?
Despite the working conditions on The Shining proving to be difficult for the cast and crew, they must have had an inkling that they were part of something special. A movie that would be discussed, rewatched, and theorized about decades later. As I mentioned earlier in this episode, I was younger than the certificate of the movie when I first saw it. Thanks again, Jailbird Freddy. Many of the themes and hidden meanings in the movie were lost on me. The most highbrow I got back then was getting a kick out of the shape-shifting alien bounty hunters in Critters 2, or witnessing a gigantic alligator devour people in dark alleys in the underrated movie Alligator. It wasn't until I started studying film and subsequently began working in the movie industry that I was able to rewatch The Shining and appreciate just how complex and layered the movie really is. I also began theorizing about the film and became fascinated about just exactly what lurked behind door number 237. In fact, the recent documentary Room 237 is an awesome insight from 5 very different viewpoints of the movie, each with bizarre but compelling theories about the hidden meanings in the film. One of the most spectacular is that Stanley Kubrick was hired by the American government to fake the Apollo moon landing, and The Shining is Kubrick's way of explaining it himself. See, I told you, bizarre. However, is it as tenuous as it suggests? The narrator describes the evidence in the film in great detail. Jack bickering with his wife Wendy about his work mirrors Kubrick's own justification for complying with government orders, Danny's Apollo 11 sweater, and even a room key with the label Room Number 237. which could be rearranged to read Moon Room. Other similarly fantastical theories include one which suggests that the maze in the movie is a retelling of the mythological tale of Theseus and the Minotaur, with Jack being the child-devouring monster with his facial expressions in the movie said to imitate the creature. There's also a scene where Danny sees the twin girls, and above them are two posters that show a man skiing and a fellow riding a bull, but are actually images of minotaurs. Tenuous? Probably. But with such a visionary director as Stanley Kubrick, can anything be written off completely? Another fascinating aspect of The Shining is that it is quite the departure from the events in the novel. In fact, if you believe another theory from Room 237, Stanley Kubrick even included a clear visual dig at Stephen King's novel in order to disown it somewhat. See, in the book, the family drive a red VW Beetle towards their new home at the Overlook Hotel, while in the movie the car is yellow, and you can see a red Beetle later on mangled in a crash with a trailer. It's a subtle FU to the source material, and to Stephen King himself, who was famously vocal about his dislike for Kubrick's movie.
With Kubrick's The Shining, I felt that it was very cold.
While many of these theories can be discussed and debated about for many more decades to come, what's important to remember is that film is subjective, and the mise-en-scène theory taught in film school is actually a massively important part of the visual medium. A personal take on the movie from many during a rewatch would be that it exists as a dreamlike, disorienting experience in which the inhabitants of the Overlook Hotel are all part of Jack in his own version of hell, and are reliving his past as part of a feverish nightmare. Just look at some of the inconsistencies in the movie. The window in Ullman's office can't exist, as the room is right in the middle of the building. And in another sequence, Halloran is giving a tour to Wendy and Danny, and they enter a giant cooler in one room, but exit a completely different one across the room. Kubrick was such a meticulous filmmaker that surely those were intentional. Ultimately, The Shining is a movie so rich in thematic imagery that it is impossible to watch over and over and not come away with a completely different experience each time. In fact, in one scene, we see Jack nonchalantly reading a copy of Playgirl. And if you look up the issue, it has a heading about incest, and the film even alludes to physical abuse between Jack and Danny. Perhaps there was more to this than first imagined, and it won't be by chance that Jack Nicholson was given this particular magazine to read in that scene. Also, rewatch the Toy Story movies, and you'll see many references from the film, mainly because director Lee Unkrich is a Shining super fan.
Velocistar 237?
Oh!
And even runs his own fan site called The Overlook Hotel. So what is your take on The Shining? And what are the theories that you have from watching this film? Did Kubrick really take the Apollo moon landing? And is it actually possible for an office in the middle of a building to have a window with glistening sunlight beaming through it? Or is it another hidden meaning in the movie? Let us know in the comments, and while you're at it, why don't you tell your friends who like this sort of content about our new series?
A little slow tonight, isn't it?
On the next episode, save the date as JoBlo and Arrow in the Head take you back to the most important night of your high school lives. Wear your best tuxes, dresses, and prepare some killer dance moves. But if you drink the spiked punch, chase it down with one of the best chase scenes in slasher movie history in Prom Night. Prom Night. Everything is all right.
Hi, friends, your humble narrator Tyler Nichols here, and I hope that you enjoyed that episode of 80s Horror Memories. If you missed our previous episode, click over here. If you want to see more from our series, click up here. And if you're not subscribed yet, what are you doing? Subscribe right here. And most importantly, stay spooky, folks.